Mages are too OP. Chapter 1, Head Explosion. It was a ceiling that he had never seen before. After Roland opened his eyes, he saw an enormous statue of a woman above his head. The statue was made of black rock, with vague greenness flowing on the surface. But when he observed it more carefully, the greenness was gone. Roland sat up and found himself on a blue stone platform that seemed like a ritual table for sacrifices in the medieval age. It was cold and rough. There was a unique fragrance in the air. He looked around and saw strange grasses burning below the statue of the goddess not far away behind him. The grasses seemed to be wormwood, albeit with more teeth at the edge. Wait, fragrance? He could smell and even feel? Roland touched the ritual table again, sensing its roughness and coldness. He then sniffed hard. This time, he smelled both the strange fragrance of the grasses and the bitter scent of the stone building itself. Am I really not hypnotized, but in an immersive game? It feels so real. Roland looked at his hands. They were fair and slim, as expected of the hands of a spellcaster. He pinched his arm. There was pain, but not too obvious. It came as no surprise. After all, before he entered the game, he had read the official announcement which stated that the pain in the game was only 1/10 of that in reality. Roland rose from the platform. He looked around and realized that he was in a building made of rocks. There was a goddess statue, a ritual table, and several rows of chairs up ahead. Judging from the arrangement, it was likely to be a chapel. Jumping from the ritual table, Roland observed his body. He was wearing gray and brown clothes made of linen, which was not exactly comfortable. His shoes were ugly and thin. He could feel the cold stone below his feet as he stepped on the ground. It's very real. Roland sighed and touched the ritual table. The stones felt so real. The granules on their surface were identical to reality. He did not expect the game to be a legitimate immersive game exactly as Penguin Corporation claimed, not a VR counterfeit that intended to fool people's money. When was such great technology developed, and how could it have been developed by Penguin Corporation? Roland sighed with mixed feelings. The immersive cabin that he bought with $50,000 was definitely worth it. He was about to observe the environment some more and adapt himself to his new body, when the ragged door of the chapel opened. While the door was still creaking, a hunched old man walked in. His eyebrows were long and white and dangled to his slender cheeks. His eyelids were so loose that they almost covered his eyes. He was wearing a long white robe that had a symbol of a tree at the center. Before he joined the game, Roland had studied the basics of this game world from its official website. If he recalled correctly, the clothes were the standard uniform of the Church of Life. Only the reverends of the Church of Life wore them. The old man was surprised to see Roland at first, but then he relaxed. The change in his expression, both the movement of his facial muscles and his eyes, was exactly like that of a real person, instead of an NPC in the game. In the VR games that Roland had played, facial changes had always been a flaw in NPC behavior no matter how real the NPCs seemed to be. Even though NPCs' expressions were abundant thanks to motion capture, one would inevitably feel horrible when they changed their expressions. But right now, Roland felt that he had met a real person. Was the newcomer another player? He dropped the idea very soon. He was among the first batch to join the game. It was impossible for a player to become a reverend so quickly. Also, more importantly, players all appeared as young human beings in the game, and what Roland saw was a withering old man. However, the old man was too real. Roland felt that he was a real person even though he did not talk and was only staring at Roland. His eyes, his stance, his blinking eyes, his moles, his dry and yellow skin. He could even see that the old man's temples were vaguely throbbing because of the flow of blood. Roland was not involved in the game industry, but he had played a lot of games, including Pac-Man at the beginning and the exquisite VR games right now. Even though the games today could make NPCs look vivid, they still lacked the critical essence, which was the soul. Yet, the old man gave the feeling that he was a living person with a soul, instead of an NPC built with cold data inside a human skin, when he was doing nothing but standing. Is this a guiding NPC? The official website did not mention anything about a guiding NPC. Confused, Roland asked, "Hello, mister. What is this place?" The old man was stunned for a while. Then, he waved his hand and spoke in a language that Roland had never heard. Even though he could not understand, Roland had inferred from the old man's countenance that he was expressing his inability to understand Roland. Shoot! Roland cursed the producer of this game for their pursuit of perfection. Had they set up different languages for the NPCs in this world? If the introduction on the official website was to be believed, there were dozens of countries and races in this game world. If every country and every race had their own language, how much work would have to be done? If it was true, BLI***ard and UB***soft would be nothing but kindergartners in front of Penguin Corporation. Though dissatisfied, Roland had a solution. He remembered that he had pre-learned language proficiency, a level 2 spell, when he created the character in the game. In many of the sandbox games he played, although everybody used the same language, the players of different countries or sides would hear and see random words if they did not know each other's language thanks to the setting of the games. Roland felt lucky that he had abundant game experience. He summoned the system in his mind. He was clumsy at first. After all, an immersive game was different from a VR game, but soon, he got the hang of it and found skills on Magic Book. Then, he locked on language proficiency. A strange chart popped up in front of his eyes, with a lot of blue nodes on it. A blue node that seemed to be the starting point glittered and shot a streak of redness to another node in the blink of an eye. Is this a spellcasting chart? While Roland considered the possibility, the red link between the two nodes suddenly began to tremble. Then, it trembled harder and harder, and Roland felt a stronger and stronger headache. What's going on? Roland had played games for 20 years, but it was the first time he played an immersive one. He had no experience and did not know how to deal with the situation. Several seconds later, the red link finally broke apart in the violent quakes. Before that, the pain in Roland's head was already insufferable, as if needles had been stuck inside. The moment the red link broke apart, Roland's consciousness was ejected out of his body in the game. Then, he discovered, to his surprise, that his game character's head exploded. The headless corpse fell heavily on the ground, blood splashing everywhere. Roland's consciousness stood next to the corpse as a transparent soul. He was so surprised that he froze and did not know how to react. The old man's hair, face, and clothes were covered with blood. He opened his mouth that had few teeth left, stunned. Chapter 2, Resurrection. Faucon was the only reverend in the Church of Life in Red Mountain Town. He worked as a mercenary for 2 years and traveled in a lot of places when he was young. Although he had only lived in Red Mountain Town afterward, he always considered himself a worldly man. But today, he felt that he was too ignorant. He did not know the new way of suicide, which was to detonate one's own head with magic recoil. Every spellcaster would have been impressed by such an accurate detonation. Faucon finally closed his mouth. The young man who emerged in his temple should be the undying golden sun that would arrive today according to the oracle, which said that he would reappear on the ritual table in the temple after he died. But what if he didn't? There were so many temples of the Church of Life in the world, and there were only finite golden suns. He might not reach his temple. Now, how should he deal with this headless body in this place that looked like the scene of a homicide? He had been a reputable reverend in Red Mountain Town for decades. He did not expect this before his death. It would be the time of prayer in the town soon. If the villagers saw him standing in the chapel soaked in blood next to the headless male, he could imagine what theory the villagers would come up with. It took the Church of Life decades to establish grounds in this village. If the villagers lost their faith because of this incident, he would be too ashamed to face the goddess when he was summoned by her later. Faucon had a strong headache. The thing he most dreaded happened. The wooden door behind Faucon opened, and a plump lady cried as loudly as if she were a virtuoso when she saw the horrifying scene. She even fell on the floor when Faucon turned around with brains and blood all over his body. "Don't be scared, Susan," said Faucon intimidatingly. "I'm Faucon. About this." "What? You're Reverend Faucon?" Surprisingly, the plump lady named Susan relaxed after distinguishing Faucon's voice. She jumped up and cursed at Roland's headless body. "Reverend, was he a burglar? You've done a great job. Wait a moment. I'll ask other people to help you. He was stupid enough to rob you." Cursing, she left and cried out, "Somebody help! The old reverend has killed a burglar. Come here and help him move the body out." Hearing the exclamations and yells, Faucon grinned, tears in his dirty eyes. Soon, a bunch of people swarmed in. Most of them were adults, children were kept outside. They gasped when they saw the ghastly scene and then cursed the burglar who broke into the temple. None of them suspected that Faucon was a murderer. After discussing for a while, some of them fetched clean water to mop the floor, and some went for a piece of cloth to move the body away and burn it. More people were gathered around old Faucon, asking if he was hurt. They obviously cared about him. Some even wiped the disgusting blood stains on his clothes for him. None of them, including old Faucon, saw that Roland's consciousness had stayed next to his body. To be more exact, Roland was invisible to them when he was in the state of consciousness. Roland finally returned to himself from the unexpected pain. He confirmed that his body in the game had been killed by the head explosion due to inappropriate spellcasting. It was one of the most hilarious ways of death that he knew. He would have laughed non-stop if it happened to any other player, but since he was the victim here, he could only weep in sorrow. No wonder the difficulty of Mage was listed as 10 stars on the official website of the game, which was the highest difficulty of all classes. Warlock and Priest, the other two classes of spellcasters, were only 5 stars. Roland recalled the notice he read before entering this virtual world. After a player died, they could be resurrected several seconds after their consciousness found a temple of the Church of Life and Light on the ritual table. He observed the people who were busy next to his body. In this state of consciousness, he only had regular sight and could not smell, taste, or feel anything. He felt panicked and horrible when he stayed in this environment of sensory deprivation for too long. He hurried to climb on the ritual table and lie down. The stone skirt of the goddess skirt was before him again. Of course, there was nothing underneath the skirt except for simple stone structures. It was not fun at all. While Roland was having random thoughts, the goddess statue's eyes glowed a green that illuminated his consciousness. His consciousness turned warm, and strange energy flowed within. Then, he became dizzy. By the time he woke up again, he found himself lying on the ritual table. He stood up, only to discover that the NPCs who were busy moving the body stared at him in surprise with their mouths gaping. At this moment, he felt slightly cold. He lowered his head. Then, he couldn't have looked more awful. He was entirely naked, without the tiniest piece of cloth. Roland was so embarrassed that he would rather kill himself. Trying to remain calm, he glanced at the crowd and wondered how he could extricate himself from this awkward situation. But soon, he heaved a long sigh, because it was impossible for him to explain himself when he did not know the language. It had been proved that he couldn't activate language proficiency for now. At this moment, the old reverend said something to the crowd, and they left the temple in order. The last of them even closed the door. The temple became dim again. The headless body was still lying on the ground. The blood on the old reverend's face was gone, but brains still lingered on his clothes, which was rather creepy. Roland, however, was not scared, because the blood and gore had been thoughtfully blurred into harmless squares in the game. Chapter 3, Communication. One of them was a dying old man covered in blood, and the other was a naked, fresh young man. Roland had read plenty of books on religion, of course, mostly non-serious ones. He heard that some reverends liked boys best. Roland's character was only 17 years old. Was he a little boy in the old man's eyes? Thinking about that, he felt a toothache and became wary. He jumped backward. With the ritual table in between as an obstacle, he was more relaxed. Perhaps because the negative effect of resurrection had passed, Roland felt a lot more comfortable. He covered his genitals with one hand and gazed at the reverend. He wouldn't have been scared of such an old man in reality because he could easily beat the old man up if he asked for trouble. However, he was in a highly simulative game, and the old man was a reverend of the Church of Life. Different from the fat reverends who were obsessed with boys in reality, the reverends in this game were capable of real spells. Seeing the young man's wariness, Faucon smiled at him. Maybe because he looked trustworthy, the young man seemed more or less relaxed. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Faucon raised his hand and pointed at the young man's forehead. Roland did not expect that the stranger would cast a spell without any warning. A green ball of light dashed at him, but it was not too fast. Roland hurried to dodge, but the light ball followed him and hit his head after a turn, before it transformed like jelly and leaked through his skull into his brain. Roland thought that the reverend was trying to kill him. After all, it was not unusual for a player to be killed by an NPC. He expected more head-exploding agony, but to his surprise, he felt nothing except a twinge in his head. "Young man, you should be able to understand me now." It was not any language that Roland was aware of, but he could understand what the reverend was saying now. Roland was briefly stunned, but he soon realized what was going on. Holding his forehead, he gasped and said, "Language proficiency? Mister, please wait a moment and let me put on my clothes first." Roland was certainly not a fan of nudity. He soon found the option, "Pick up your body," on the menu and clicked Confirm. Roland's headless body turned into countless white cubes in a few seconds, which were stretched into a beautiful ribbon and flew back into Roland. The scattered brains and blood turned into flecks of light and also flew back to him. It was a beautiful view. Not just that, the temple was back to normal, and the stains on Faucon's clothes were entirely gone. The place changed from a gruesome slaughterhouse back into the peaceful chapel. Roland's consciousness received the system's reminder: you've retrieved your body and recovered 50% of the experience that you lost after you died. The amount of recovered experience is 0. Because Roland's head exploded soon after he was born, he hadn't gained any experience yet. Naturally, none of it could be recovered. When the glistening cubes all returned to Roland, new clothes were added to him. They were exactly the clothes he wore at the beginning. Roland was much more poised with clothes on him. He nodded and said, "Mister, thank you for your trouble. How long can this language proficiency last?" "Around 3 hours," said Faucon weakly and hoarsely, like every old man. He was rather confident that the stranger was a golden son, according to the oracle. "When I was young, it could last more than 5 hours. Most old men cherished their feats when they were young." This old man, though a reverend and an NPC, was no exception. Roland secretly chuckled but said normally, "I am Roland." "What's your name, senior?" "Faucon." After offering his name, Faucon eyed the young man up and down. Judging from his action and behavior, he did not seem to be a man of manners. Yet, he had an odd air around him that made Faucon feel that it was just the way he talked and he did not mean to be rude. Faucon was a reverend, a senior, and a former mercenary. For regular people, he was a high and mighty savior of the world. But essentially speaking, Faucon was only a human being who was slightly above average, and who had lost his source of intelligence after he settled down here. On many occasions, intelligence was not just intelligence, but also knowledge. Having lost the sources of intelligence and knowledge in this small town, Faucon knew very well that he barely made any progress in the past decades. If anything, he even retrograded. However, he did not regret it. Glorifying the goddess in this town was what he was most proud of in his life. The golden sun before him seemed approachable, but there was no telling what was on his mind. Logically, since he was revived on the ritual table for the goddess, he must be rather intimate with the goddess. "Mr. Roland, you must be a golden son." "No," ventured Faucon prudently. He couldn't be more careful until he figured out the personality of this young man. "A few days ago, the goddess left an oracle which stated that you would arrive from the outer dimensions and live with us. Is that the role of the players in this game?" Roland found it curious. In most games, players were set as saviors or powerful, special persons. It was the first time that he had been treated as a foreigner. However, it did make sense on second thought. There couldn't be 500,000 saviors, could there? Roland nodded. "I'm probably a golden sun that you mentioned, and I'm indeed from an outer dimension. Mister, can I ask you a question?" Faucon smiled. "By all means." "Where am I?" Roland looked around as he spoke. "I know that this is a temple of the life goddess. What I would like to know is my current location." Faucon turned around and opened the door. The morning sunlight flowed into the temple like an orange brook, bright and warm. Basking in the sunlight as if there was a halo around him, the Reverend smiled at Roland. "Welcome to Red Mountain Town." Chapter 4, Red Mountain Town. Following the old man, Roland walked out of the temple. The sun was not so dazzling in the morning, but he subconsciously closed his eyes when he was faced with it. A few moments later, Roland grew accustomed to the luminescence and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the pure and clean sky, which was not half as polluted as in modern society. Below the blue sky was a glistening lake on which there were several black leaf-like spots. Upon closer look, Roland discovered that they were tiny boats. Many buildings of different heights and colors were around the lake. Among the buildings were lines of villagers, marching along like ants. A huge bridge connected the two ends of the lake and divided it into two parts. Roland breathed the fresh air and listened to the whistle of the wind on the mountaintop, feeling tranquilized. After a long time, he said to the old man, "This is Red Mountain Town? I think it should be called Lake Town." Faucon's eyebrows lowered, as if he were not in a good mood. "It's not a good name. Mr. Roland, what's your plan? Not a good name? Because it does not sound good, or for other reasons? Roland was curious, but noticing that Faucon was not happy, he did not pursue further. Roland was truly impressed by the producer of this game who had made both the scenes and the NPCs so vivid. More importantly, the game accurately reproduced human senses, except for the sense of pain that was reduced to 1/10 as a protective measure. After all, if the pain of being hurt or killed was perfectly simulated, only masochistic players could have endured it. Roland considered the question for a while and then said uncertainly, "Travel and play, probably." Faucon looked at Roland in surprise, his narrowed eyes slightly widened. Simple as that? Shouldn't you have lofty ideals such as saving the world, defeating demons, or slaying a dragon? Roland smiled at Faucon's surprise and amusement. He said slowly, "I'm just an ordinary person. I don't know how you view the Golden Sons. That's what you call us, right? But most of us have come to this world for fun. Maybe our dreams will change later, but that is our purpose for now." Roland meant it. At first, he thought that he was to be given a quest. However, he found it impossible to regard Faucon, who felt so real, as a pure NPC. Roland was not an idiot. Talking to an NPC and talking to a real person were different. However, though Faucon was obviously an NPC, Roland had the feeling that he was talking to a real person. He didn't have to be serious in a conversation with such a gentle old man, but he should be at least sincere. Faucon looked at Roland, feeling strange. He had never seen a human being like Roland before, who had an undying body but whose biggest dream was to go sightseeing for fun. Other people who had such abilities would probably have great ambitions, not just fulfilling themselves but even conquering the world. The Golden Sun before him, however, only wanted to have fun? Nobody else would have believed it, because it didn't make sense, but Faucon did. He had seen a lot of people who were highly aggressive, but the person before him was as innocent as a baby. The dimension you're from must be free of war and carnage. Faucon looked at the young man inside. Isn't it marvelous? Actually, it isn't. Roland shook his head helplessly. But the country I'm from is rather safe. It's peaceful and prosperous. Occasionally, unbelievable things happen, but they're all far away from me. For Roland, it was a plain explanation, but for Faucon, it was pure bragging. His white robe moving under the cool morning breeze, Faucon heaved a long sigh and said, "If only I could live in your world." Roland looked at the old reverend with great interest. Thanks to his major in college, he had been in touch with the famous AI. Although he had no chance to get to know AlphaGo, he was quite familiar with Siri. Siri did quite well in daily conversations and acted like a regular person. However, in the more in-depth conversations, including those about life, world events, or history, Siri was obviously not intelligent enough and would give rigid and mechanical replies. The old man before his eyes, however, was no different than a regular person when he was sad or envious in a conversation. Roland was not sure that Penguin Corporation could achieve that. Besides, according to the official website, there were more than 15 billion intelligent people living in this game world, and every NPC could compare to a real person. What technology had Penguin Corporation, which was famous for its counterfeit products, developed? Before he entered the game, Roland was never convinced of such propaganda, because every company tended to oversell their product. However, he believed it after meeting this old man named Faucon. He could imagine how spectacular this world could be if all the NPCs had a unique personality and soul, real scenery and perfectly simulated NPCs. Roland felt the passion for games that he hadn't felt for a long time. He slapped his thigh hard and asked, "Mr. Faucon, how should I go to the nearest city from here?" Faucon was surprised. The young man, who had been calm so far, suddenly had strange enthusiasm. The guy's eyes were still clear, but there was now new light in them. "Go down the road on the west side. You will see Delphin in 4 hours if you're on foot." Faucon paused for a moment and continued, "You'd better not deviate from the main road on your way. There's a maple forest next to the road outside of Red Mountain Town. Many enormous spiders live in the forest. Normally, they don't come to our territory, but when they're too hungry, they might go crazy and hunt human beings." "Thank you, Mr. Roland waved at Faucon and walked down the gray steps on the mountain road. The morning sun was as bright as an orange, and the breeze was as gentle as a veil. The noises of the town gradually found their way into Roland's ears. Roland was of a mind to open his arms and embrace the blue sky and the white clouds, but he was afraid that he would seem too silly. He simply pursed his lips and murmured, "Phelan, I'm here." Chapter 5, You Gotta Be Kidding Me. The journey from the mountaintop to the foot of the mountain took Roland only 10 minutes. Many people were waiting for him down there with smiles of amusement. Some of them were even gesturing to show the size and shape of a certain organ on Roland, raising the audience's chuckle. Roland's face was burning, but he pretended to be cool and passed them. He could feel their eyes on his back even though he was dozens of meters away. It was certainly not the best experience for a beginner of the game. If it had happened in reality, Roland would probably have to move to a different city, but since he was in a game, embarrassing as it might be, he felt a lot more relaxed when he remembered that they were all NPCs. However, those people's response was truly logical. As the game had claimed, every NPC was as intelligent as a real person. Roaming the street, Roland observed the busy folk around him. Some were walking in a hurry, some were peddling their wares, and some were carrying heavy bags for other people. All of them seemed to be ordinary people. All of them were dark-skinned and in linen clothes. Occasionally, younger women with fairer skin walked on the street. Compared to them, Roland was actually the strangest one. He was also wearing gray and brown linen clothes, but his skin was even fairer than that of any woman. It was obvious that he had never suffered. Therefore, other people stared at him anywhere he went. Ignoring people's judgmental eyes, Roland finally made it to the bridge. He had remembered the basic streets of this town when he was on the mountaintop, so he did not have to ask the way. The stone bridge was broad and straight. On its two sides was the glittering lake. When the damp wind over the lake touched his ears, he felt like he was flying. Roland couldn't help but gaze at the rippling lake that looked like a sapphire on top of the rail. He could see the whole lake from the mountaintop, but now that he was on the bridge, the lake seemed to be endless. On the boats far away, the fishermen were trawling while singing songs. From behind the bridge came 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. They were around 7, and each of them was carrying a basket. In patched clothes, the snotty children hopped to Roland's back. They pointed at Roland and laughed at the same time. At this moment, language proficiency was not over yet, and Roland could understand them. Mom says that he loves being naked. Grandpa says that there may be something wrong with his head. Dad says that he was trying to seduce a woman. What is seduce? Roland turned around and looked at the kids helplessly. Wow! The kids rushed to the other end of the bridge as if they were scared of him, before they grimaced at him gloatingly. His sightseeing mood was ruined by the kids. Roland brushed his hands together and went on. The 3 kids ran farther and farther away until they were nowhere to be seen. Donkey carts crossed the bridge now and then. Roland intended to hitchhike at first, but he soon gave up the idea. After all, the things, mostly feces and other strange items, on those carts were too disgusting. Across the bridge, Roland left the town and embarked on a village road. He could tell that the road was bumpy and ragged even though he was wearing shoes. Logically, since he was used to tarmac roads in cities, he should be exhausted after walking on such a shabby road for a while. Yet, oddly enough, he did not feel tired after walking for almost an hour. Perhaps it's because I'm a character in the game. Roland thought of the possibility. As Red Mountain Town was left far behind, it was quieter and quieter. Next to the road was a forest. Roland occasionally saw donkey carts when he left the town, but now all he could hear was the blowing leaves and the powerful wind. The strange chirps of unknown birds added to the emptiness of the forest. After Roland crossed a hill, the trees beside the road turned into maples. Nothing could be heard here except for the wind, not even bugs. Roland remembered that this was the habitat of giant spiders. How giant were those spiders? Roland was rather curious, but he gave up the idea of visiting them. His plan was to go to a city and look for other players. Also, transportation was more convenient in the city, and it should be easier to search for intelligence or jobs. He could stay in the city until he earned enough money to go to other cities after he reached out to his friends. It was already noon at this point. The sunlight was rather scorching. Roland sat down in the shade of a tree and decided to rest for a moment. Hardly had he sat down when he heard the vague, distant cries of little kids. Nobody was on the road, and the place was awfully quiet. Roland looked around and saw nothing but trees and colorful weeds. He chuckled and thought he was hallucinating now that he was in an empty, quiet environment by himself. It must be how ghost stories originated. Leaning against the tree, Roland fanned himself with his hand and listened to the howling wind, enjoying the peacefulness. However, he jumped up the next second and charged into the woods. It was because he heard another scream, which was still vague but sounded familiar. Then, he remembered that it was the voice of one of the 3 kids who made fun of him an hour ago, specifically, the girl, because her voice was very distinct. The 3 kids had been ahead of him. Giant spiders, little kids. Was it possible? The screams became clear soon after he rushed into the woods. It was not until he entered the woods that he noticed how dim it was below the trees. Rotten leaves were emitting stench everywhere. There were also white nets at the roots of many trees. At this moment, the kids were crying up ahead, nearby. Roland rushed. Unsteadily, he passed a dozen weird maples that were at least 2 meters in diameter, only to see the most chilling scene. The 3 kids were on the branch of a tall tree, and a huge spider was knocking the tree below them. After each collision, the tree would shake for a while, and the kids on top would shrill in fear. How big was this spider? It was at least 1.5 meters tall. Considering the length of its appendages, it was more than 2 meters wide. Shoot! Roland was an ordinary person in reality after all. His legs were trembling beyond his control when he saw such an unbelievable monster unexpectedly. Chapter 6: Gains and Losses. Roland had always been a fan of horror and mystery movies. He had also fantasized a lot what he would do when he encountered monsters or ghosts. In his fantasy, he was brave and determined. Even though he was badly wounded, he could still struggle to escape. However, when he was faced with a real monster, Roland realized that fantasy was just an ungrounded daydream that could easily be wrecked by the hammer called reality. Besides, what he was faced with was not exactly the hammer of reality. It was just a game. The spider did not see Roland. If Roland were to flee, he should be able to escape, but when he saw the 3 kids who were crying and trembling in fright, he found it impossible to turn tail and run. One can find 10,000 excuses to be weak, but one only requires a single reason to be brave. Roland squatted and found a rock and a broken branch. He twisted the front end of the branch to make it pointy. I'm a player. This is a game. I don't need to be afraid. Roland murmured to himself. At this moment, the spider crashed into the tree again. Even though he was a dozen meters away, he saw the cracking bark of the tree and felt the earth tremble. The 3 kids on the tree were nearly thrown off, which made them even more scared. They screamed and shouted, tears and snot all over their faces. They couldn't have looked more wretched. He couldn't wait anymore. Roland grabbed the rock and hurled it out. He roared, "Monster, check this out!" While Roland did not have great aim, the spider was too large for him to miss. The rock hit its body, causing a strange metallic noise, before it was deflected elsewhere. Sensing the attack from behind, the giant spider moved with its 8 legs and turned around quickly. Roland gasped at the abominable appearance of the spider. It had more than 100 red complex eyes on its head. Patients with trypophobia would have lost the courage to fight it. Even more horrifyingly, it had a pair of black sickles that extended from the 2 sides of its mouth. They were long and spiky, with thorns at the ends. It was not hard to imagine what terrible wounds the sickles could cause. It was a classic predator. Roland was of a mind to use magic. He remembered that, apart from language proficiency, he had 2 level 1 spells, namely Inferior Fireball and Hand of Magic, which he learned when he created the character. However, since his head might explode if he failed to cast the spell, Roland gave up the idea. If the would-be hero died first, there would be no hope for the 3 kids. The giant spider stared at Roland for a while. Then, it turned back and hit the tree again. Immediately, the three kids cried out. Roland couldn't hold back anymore. He took a deep breath and charged at the spider, which showed no reaction when he approached. Delighted, Roland raised his stick and bashed the joint on the rightmost leg of the spider. Roland learned that the spider's body was hard from his first attempt to throw a rock. So, Roland tried to attack the spider's joint this time. Based on his fundamental understanding of biology, the joints of most creatures were vulnerable. The stick hit the spider's joint heavily. Then, Roland discovered, to his surprise, that he seemed to be stronger than he thought. But as a spellcaster, he only had 5 points of strength. How strong would the warriors be when they had 10 points of strength at the beginning? Green body fluid spluttered when the giant spider's leg was hit. Then, the monster cried in shock and fury. It turned around quickly, and the black sickles on its mouth swooped at the enemy. Though Roland had prepared himself and jumped back the moment the spider turned around, his jump was not too long, because he was neither a warrior nor an agile class. The two black sickles penetrated his legs and nailed him to the ground. It was painful, but still bearable. After all, he could only sense 1/10 of the pain. The enormous spider knocked Roland down and dragged him back, leaving a long trail of blood on the ground behind him. Seeing that it had gotten its prey, the giant spider opened its mouthpart slowly. Right then, Roland stuck the pointy end of his stick into the spider's mouthpart brutally and shouted to the top of the tree, "Get down and run!" It was all that he could say, because the spider had lifted him and smashed him twice, causing excruciating pain. He was too dizzy to say anything anymore. The three kids slipped down from the tree after a brief shock. The two boys cried and ran away, but the slim little girl picked up a stick, shaking but trying to help. Roland shouted angrily when he saw her, "Idiot, run!" The girl was dazed when Roland yelled at her. Then, she dropped the stick and ran away, weeping. Roland was rather comforted to watch her disappear. As a player, it was nothing for him to die once, but if the girl died, she would be gone for good. He remembered that, according to the game's promotion, all NPCs were unique. They would have their own lives. They would grow up and turn old. They would succeed and fail. Once they were dead, they would never respawn. Have I just saved a life? Roland was smiling when the enormous spider lifted him and smashed him again. After 5 times, Roland's consciousness was ejected out of his body. As a third party, he observed the spider tear his body apart, blood all over the ground. Yet, Roland was not pissed, because he knew very well that the spider couldn't live long. After all, the spider could not eat until it got rid of the pointy stick in its mouthpart. Death was awaiting the spider. At this moment, an option popped up before his eyes: "You're too far away from the nearest resurrection point. Do you want to leap to the nearest resurrection point?" Chapter 7, Don't Be Picky. Roland was resurrected on the ritual table in the Temple of the Life Goddess, naked once again, but he felt much more exhausted this time than the previous one. He opened the system menu, only to discover that he had a 2-hour weakness debuff. In a regular game, the debuff would have only resulted in the decline of attributes, and the player could wait it out. However, it was not the case in this game. At this moment, Roland did not feel like moving at all. He breathed hard on the ritual table, and he finally got off after he caught his breath. Nobody was in the temple. Roland wandered inside the temple, only to feel even more exhausted. He had to sit on a chair and take a rest. Soon, he fell asleep. After a long time, the gate of the temple opened, and Faucon came in with a set of white clothes. He was not surprised to see naked Roland again. Roland was woken up by the noise. He subconsciously covered his private parts, but he was relieved after discovering that it was Faucon. Faucon cast language proficiency at Roland and handed the clothes to him. Then he said, "Put it on, son." Roland took the clothes. It was a long robe, with bright blue stripes of light vaguely flowing on it. It was definitely extraordinary. He couldn't help but comment, "This must be a magic item." "Yes." Faucon smiled and said, "It was my suit when I was a mercenary. It can slightly improve the effects of spells. Though it's a magic item, it's not very valuable. I'm only keeping it as a memento. I can't accept this." Roland shook his head. Faucon smiled. But you don't have any clothes, do you? Roland realized that he had a point. So, he accepted the robe and put it on. It fit him perfectly. After he put on the clothes, he felt dizzy again and fell back to the chair. What's wrong? Faucon could tell that Roland was not well. I'm weakened due to consecutive resurrections, said Roland bitterly. Faucon was silent for a moment, before he said, Thank you for saving the kids. Roland said in surprise, You already knew? Why else would I come here? Faucon smiled. The 3 kids ran back in tears. Although their accounts didn't make a lot of sense, they managed to tell us how they were accidentally cornered by a giant spider and how you saved them only to get yourself killed. Roland found it odd. The territory of those spiders is not far away from Red Mountain Town. Why don't you try to remove them? There may be dire consequences if they break into the town. After a brief silence, Faucon said bitterly, Those giant spiders are monsters. Ordinary people can't defeat them. Also, there are too many of them. Only professionals can kill them. But the problem is that I am the only professional in Red Mountain Town, and I'm better at healing than fighting. The old man seemed rather helpless. Actually, there were a dozen cases of giant spiders assaulting human beings every year, and most of the victims were children. Adults ran faster and could usually escape from the monsters, but little kids were not as lucky. If I could use magic, the battle wouldn't have been so hard. Roland was rather angry that he failed to crush the giant spider when he was capable of doing so. Mister, can you teach me the tricks of magic? Faucon stared at Roland for a while and smiled. He had the same determination when he was young, but his ambition couldn't make up for his aptitude, which was too humble. The young man, however, was different. He could tell that the guy was smart and had a decent education. There are 3 types of spellcasters. I'm a priest, you are a mage, and there's also warlocks. I can't teach you sophisticated things, after all, I'm only a low-level professional myself, said Faucon slowly. However, I can teach you some of the basic knowledge. To cast a spell, a mage has to connect magic nodes. The faster you connect, the less time it will take for you to cast a spell. You can begin with the fundamental spells, so that your head will not explode due to magic recoil even though your attempts fail. Faucon pointed at his own head teasingly. Roland could only chuckle. After all, it was a rather embarrassing experience. You should go out and eat something. You can consider magic later. Faucon pointed at the gate and said, Usually, people feel weak when they are hungry. Roland did feel like eating something. He was truly hungry. This game was quite real and had simulated the feeling of hunger. However, he smiled bitterly and said, I don't have any money. If our great hero starves, it will be a shame upon Red Mountain Town. Faucon helped Roland to his feet and dragged him out. To Roland's surprise, the old man was rather strong, although he seemed to be on the verge of death. After they left the temple, Roland discovered in shock that a small cottage had been established to the left of the temple. It was not spacious, but he saw a bed, cabinet, table, chairs and other furniture from the window. On the desk was hot food on wooden plates. A dozen people of different genders and ages were waiting on the way down the mountain. There were 3 kids who looked rather familiar. Roland recognized them and waved at them. Suddenly, all of the villagers bowed deeply at him. The 3 kids bent so hard that their heads almost hit the ground. Roland was somewhat stunned. Faucon patted Roland's back softly and said, You've earned this. They are all poor people who do not have much money. The only thing they can do to return your favor is to build a cottage and cook some food for you. Don't be picky. The sun was scorching at noon. Roland did not know how he should describe his complicated feelings. He tried to smile while holding back his tears. After paying tribute to him, the villagers left the mountain road. Faucon helped Roland inside the cottage and onto a chair, then took his leave. Roland gazed at the food on the table, which was still steaming hot. It was not until a long time later that he finally said helplessly, No chopsticks. I'm really not used to forks and knives. Chapter 8, Magic Modeling. Eventually, Roland managed to eat an uncomfortable lunch with a knife and a fork. Although he appreciated the villager's gift, frankly speaking, the food did not taste very good. It was either overcooked or made with the wrong ingredients. Fried fish with mushrooms and steamed pheasant with tomatoes. Roland would have flipped the table if this was served in a real restaurant, but since he was in a game, he had to deal with it. Besides, the knife and the fork were made of wood. Their bluntness made it more difficult for Roland to enjoy the food. Actually, only magnates and nobles could afford iron knives and forks in this game. Even the plates were made of wood. It was not hard to imagine the poor life of the civilians in this world. The families of the 3 kids must have done their best to provide such an abundant meal for Roland. After lunch, the weakness debuff on Roland disappeared. Roland felt agile and energetic again. It was a strange feeling. When he was weak, everything seemed to be covered in a veil, but when the state of weakness was over, not only was the veil gone, but everything was also much brighter, as if a spotlight shone on the world. His mood was much better now that he was more comfortable. Roland observed the cottage that belonged to him now with great interest. The house had a coverage of about 30 square meters. Except for the supporting pillars which were made of wood, the whole house was made up of dry grasses. Even the floor had been piled with grasses. The dry grasses were gold and still had the smell of sunlight. Such a house would have been highly attractive to tourists in reality, but here, it was just a common cottage. The cabinet and the bed were simple. They were made of several planks and carried the unique smell of wooden products. Roland was grateful to the villagers. It would have taken him more than a day to build such a cottage, but the villagers had accomplished the task in only slightly more than an hour. Now that he had a place to crash, Roland was not in a hurry to go to the city anymore. He decided to stay here and find a job to feed himself first. He wouldn't go elsewhere until he familiarized himself with the 3 spells. Otherwise, he would be killed should he encounter a monster like a giant spider. Roland rested for a while on the bed. Then, he walked to the back of the church, ready to practice spells. He summoned Magic Book from the system and looked at the 3 built-in spells of his character. Inferior Fireball, Level 1 spell. Hand of Magic, Level 1 spell. Language Proficiency, Level 2 spell. Taking a deep breath, Roland began to activate Inferior Fireball. Same as when he used Language Proficiency, a weird circle with a lot of blue nodes popped up in his head. The starting node, which was bigger than the others, darted out a red line to another blue node. Just like the first time, the red line broke off after shaking for a while, except that the consequence was much milder and Roland's head did not explode this time. He was still as alive as could be, albeit with a minor headache. This game is too realistic. It's so challenging. Roland couldn't help but complain. How are mages going to make a living when it's so difficult to cast a spell? Although he grumbled, Roland tried another experiment once his headache was gone, only to fail again. Then, his attempt failed once more 10 minutes later. After repeating this more than 10 times, Roland's nose started bleeding. Yet, Roland covered his nose and chuckled. It was true that failure was the mother of success. Although Roland hadn't cast any spells successfully yet, he made unexpected discoveries. A bright halo suddenly appeared above Roland and enshrouded him, quickly alleviating the pain in his head. He turned back and saw Faucon walking in slowly. "Thanks." Roland waved at the old man. Faucon stared at Roland as he approached him. He seemed tranquil, but he was greatly shocked deep down in his heart. He could tell that Roland was smart and a natural-born spellcaster. However, the guy's potential was still beyond his imagination. Generally speaking, even the most excellent spellcasters had to rest for more than 3 days when they had 2 or 3 consecutive failed attempts to cast a spell, or their brains would have been wounded because of the pain. But how many times had this young man failed? At least 15, from what Faucon had seen. Yet, he still seemed vigorous despite the fact that his nose was bleeding. Were all the Golden Suns such monsters? Have you discovered anything? Faucon held back his surprise and questioned Roland in a low voice. I know what magic is now. Roland extended his hand, and a bright transparent ball soon appeared in his hand. It looked rather beautiful. Fiery magic power, Faucon mumbled, enviously and yearningly. Yet, the emotions were replaced by relief only a moment later. Now that you've grasped the power of magic, it won't be long before you cast a spell. Roland, however, sighed. There are too many nodes in the spell. I can't remember them even though I've learned how to use magic. Also, it seems that different nodes will result in different magic effects. His failed attempts had not only taught him how to use magic but also informed him of the relationship between the nodes. However, the problem was that there were too many nodes, and it was hard to control the flow of power, which made spellcasting all the more difficult. Faucon turned around and walked away, not intending to stay any longer. The last thing that a mediocre person would like to see was a rapidly growing genius, which would make the mediocre person jealous. According to the teaching of the life goddess, jealousy was a sin. Although Faucon had left, his voice still came from far away gloomily. The beginner mages have to chant to cast a spell. Roland stiffened for a moment as if he were hit by lightning. Then, he was greatly enlightened. He picked up a stick and drew a profile of the nodes on the ground. He observed it intently for a while, before he numbered all the nodes. He was delighted at first but fell silent later. In the end, he became angry. He threw the wood stick away and cursed at the sky. US*kitty producers, isn't this mathematical modeling? Is this necessary? Do you have to make it so complicated? I just want to play a game. Why do you hate mages? Chapter 9, Success. Roland's excitement was perfectly understandable. Everybody wanted to pick up new skills and play on easily in a game. But the difficulty of learning spells in this game was beyond his expectations. And this was only a level 1 spell. Level 2 spells could blow up his head if he failed. Roland remembered the chart of dense nodes when he used language proficiency a few hours ago and felt freaked out. What about the level 3, level 4, and level 5 spells? How many nodes did they require the spellcaster to learn and understand? Frustrated, Roland sat back on his bed. It was already sunset. His cottage was covered by the shadows of the trees on the mountain. When the trees swayed under the wind, the spots of light in the shadows sprayed across the ground. Roland looked at the beautiful view outside the window and listened to the wind and the birds. Nature was the best tranquilizer. Roland's mood became a lot better. He stood up and returned to the profiles with his stick. Since magic nodes would not move, he could establish a coordinate system to remember their locations. The beginner mages had to chant to cast a low-level spell. Roland speculated that the chanting would not increase magic power and was only a way to remember the flow among the magic nodes. Then, would it be better if he read the coordinates of the nodes out? Roland marked the coordinates of the magic nodes and thought hard. He established the most classic X, Y, and Z axes with specific numbers. Of course, to accurately locate each node, Roland divided the 4 profiles equidistantly. It was already dark by the time he numbered all the nodes. He rested for a while in the cottage. He sniffed the leftovers from his lunch and discovered that they were not bad, so he ate again. He was rather hungry after an afternoon of hard thinking. When he was having supper, he did not notice that Faucon came to the 4 profiles he had drawn. The old man observed for a while and said in admiration, "What a detailed representation of the nodes of the magic model. Even though the spell analyzed is one of the lowest level, those 4 charts are still worth 10 gold coins. What a genius." Faucon roamed back to his temple with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a priest. He knew that magic models were valuable but he was not interested. He was only here to check on Roland's progress. After eating supper in a hurry, Roland returned to the profiles. He recorded the 4 profiles and the nodes with the photo function of the system. After all, one's memory was always limited, but photos were different. If he extracted the photos from the virtual cabin to a portable disk, they could be forever preserved until he deleted them. If only the system had a modeling app, Roland mumbled and wrote the data on the memo of the system. Let's test this line first. X23, Y1, Z56. Z55, failed. Roland's head was painful. After he recovered, he recorded the reason for the failure on the memo. Node A and Node B cannot be connected. X23. Z47, failed. Reason, too many nodes were connected, the magic line broke off. X23. Z11, failed. Reason, nodes were connected too fast. X23. Z12, failed. Reason, node C and node D cannot be connected. X23. Z09, success. Watching a small, orange fireball the size of an egg slowly floating forward and disappearing after a crack, Roland clenched his fists and shouted in relief. But soon, he repressed his excitement and wrote down the successful line of nodes on the memo with a note: "This can cast a small fireball, but it's too weak and slow to be applied in a real battle." Then, Roland tested more lines and had more successes than failures. Still, the small fireballs he cast were not satisfactory in terms of power and speed. Some of them were powerful and appeared blue, which suggested that their surface temperature was above 2000 degrees, but they were so slow that even kids could dodge them easily. Some others were fast but highly unsteady. They would take off for several meters after they were released. More and more lines were written down on his memo, and several important nodes were gradually highlighted. The mathematical model of inferior fireball had been preliminarily established. What needed to be done next was deduction and verification. Roland was certain that he could find the optimal line of nodes after a few more experiments. However, one could not be too optimistic. Accidents always happen with excessive optimism. It was a clear night with a bright moon when Roland tested spells behind the temple. Because his successful fireballs were generally small and couldn't fly far, Roland let down his guard and thought inferior fireball couldn't be too powerful. However, when he connected a new line of nodes, he realized that things were beyond his control. Roland felt that his magic power was extracted from him crazily and condensed quickly before his eyes. The previous fireballs were only as large as a fist at best, but this one was not only blue, but also bigger than a basin. It was probably inappropriate to call it a small fireball when it was so big. Roland's magic power was almost entirely supplied to this big fireball. It got rid of its creator's control the moment it took shape and darted right at the temple. Knowing that it was no good, Roland was about to shout a warning, when the fireball suddenly stopped. It expanded oddly 3 times, before it rapidly collapsed into a tiny point, unleashing astonishing brightness and an ear-splitting noise. The explosion was so loud that Roland was deafened. The dazzling light lasted only 1 second before infinite flames spewed out and swept across the area, accompanied by terrifying waves of air. Roland, who was at least 6 meters away from the site of the explosion, was flung away directly and did not hit the ground until he flew for 3 meters. He finally came to a stop when he rolled for another 5 meters. He felt that he had been hit by a heavy truck. His whole body, particularly his face, was burning. Even though the pain had been reduced to 1/10, he still felt that somebody had poured boiling oil on his cheeks. A tree 15 meters away from the explosion was nearly bent to the ground by the blast. Then, magic fire fell on a branch and ignited the tree into an enormous pillar of flame. Half of the back wall of the temple collapsed. The terrible explosion spread to Red Mountain Town at the foot of the mountain. Everybody was woken up by the rumbling sound. Cursing, yelling, crying, and barking, it was a complete mess. Chapter 10, that explains a lot. Many villagers hurriedly climbed the mountain with their torches to see what was going on. They were shocked by what they saw. Illuminated by a burning tree, the strange young man named Roland was lying on the ground, half dead, but he seemed to be grinning at the sky. His face was red and black, with plenty of blisters. Most of his hair had been burnt. Around the young man were many bright blue flames, which were not dying out even though they were on sand. The villagers knew that the young man had saved 3 kids of the town. They were going to help, when Faucon stopped them and said, "Don't approach. The blue fire is magic and will consume everything it touches. You will be burned to ashes in 2 minutes if you step on it." Faucon was highly revered in Red Mountain Town. The villagers never questioned his authority. Intimidated by his warning, the villagers dared not move anymore. Faucon waved his hand and said, "There's nothing serious here. Go back and sleep. I'll ask for your help if need be." The villagers quickly dispersed. As ordinary people, they were naturally scared of things like magic or ghosts and were happy to keep a distance from them. Soon, Faucon was left alone on the site of the explosion. Gazing at the scattered bright blue flames, he did not press forward. Although he was a priest, he dared not underestimate the fire. In his eyes, every one of those flames could burn him to ashes, too. He focused his eyes on the young man who had been scorched but who was smiling happily. Sighing enviously, he waited quietly for 20 minutes until the bright blue flames died out when the magic sustaining them ran out. Then, Faucon approached Roland and cast healing and language proficiency at him. A bright pillar of light enveloped the young man and illuminated the environment. Was it worth it? Yes. Healing was not effective immediately but took some time. Yet, it was still faster than natural recovery. Roland's body was sore and weak, but since he could only feel 1/10 of the pain, it was not too uncomfortable. Hearing Faucon's question, he replied without any hesitation or complaint, "Unveiling the magic nodes feels like lifting the skirt of the goddess of fortune bit by bit. It's really thrilling." Cough, cough. Faucon coughed hard. Although he was a believer of the life goddess, he had respect for other deities. Roland's remark sounded like blasphemy in every way. He could only pretend that he did not hear it. But of course, if Roland had compared his experience to lifting the skirt of the life goddess, Faucon definitely wouldn't have reacted so peacefully. Sorry for blowing up the wall of your temple. Lying on the ground, Roland looked up to Faucon, not because he liked to look up at other people, but because he was too weak to get back to his feet. Rest assured, I'll definitely compensate for your loss, although I don't have much money right now. It's just a wall. The temple is already ragged. I've long planned to repair it. Faucon turned around and looked at the collapsed wall, his eyelids twitching. He was not regretful about the wall, but shocked at the power of the spell. He could tell that his temple was not the target of the attack but only accidentally involved, and still, a wall had collapsed. It was not hard to infer how powerful the spell just now was. Roland had learned to control magic in 2 hours, drawn the magic models in half a day, and could even strengthen a spell with the magic model now. Genius was not enough to describe him. His knowledge was unbelievable, and he was still so young. Roland was relieved to see that Faucon was not angry. After all, Faucon had helped him a lot. If he pissed off Faucon because of this, it would be too shameful. Roland made up his mind that he would find an empty place for his magic experiments next time. Faucon sat down next to Roland and said slowly, "Son, your body can't recover so fast. Why don't we chit-chat for a while?" "That's not a bad idea." Roland agreed to the proposal, because lying on the ground was too boring. "What are we going to talk about?" "Looking at the moon in the sky," Faucon said, "let's talk about your dimension." After a brief hesitation, Roland said, "I can't tell you much. We signed an agreement before we came here. We are not allowed to tell you the details of our dimension." At this moment, Roland did not know that there was not only an agreement but also systematic censorship. The names of special entities in reality would be identified and blocked, such as computers or phones. Faucon smiled and said, "What a shame. But I'm really curious about your world. Why don't I tell you about my adventures when I was young? I'm all ears." Roland did not know why Faucon was suddenly talking about his youth, but he was rather interested, partly because it could kill time, and partly because Faucon's experience might prove useful after he left this town. With the slow and steady voice of an old man, Faucon talked about his childhood, his first crush, his ambitions, his helplessness, his self-reconciliation, and his persistence. The scroll of his life unfolded before Roland's eyes. Everybody tended to be curious about someone else's life, and Roland was not an exception. While Faucon's life was not exactly remarkable, he had his own shining and interesting stories. One of them talked and the other listened. The night passed quickly, and soon enough it was already dawn. Thanks to healing, Roland recovered fast and was already able to sit up. Based on the speed of recovery, he would be healthy again soon. Just like that, I became a believer of the life goddess and came to Red Mountain Town. The sun had already half risen, radiating orange brightness from the east. Since the temple faced the east, it was now gilded by the morning sunlight. Faucon was about to stand up, when he suddenly stopped as if time was frozen. Roland was briefly stunned. Then, he realized that he couldn't move anymore either. Not just them, the whole world consolidated and turned monochrome. The game is over for now. Please wait for the next opening. Reading the system notification in his vision, Roland exited the game, though he was not entirely satisfied yet.